All right, we got another hot topic today. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what every public school needs to know because the rules are changing a little bit. Um, I need to address one thing though, Caroline, before we get into this pretty complex legal topic. And I'm going to stick to the legal parameters of what the law says you can do and not do. And I'm not really going to go down any, what are your thoughts and personal opinions on it. I think that's important. A lot of times, like, look, have strong opinions, be passionate about things for sure. Advocate, elect leaders that that will do the laws that you love and you want. But there is a duty that once a law is in place that we, as people that work for the government or in government, whatever it is, we comply with those laws and we can actively try to change those laws, but they are the laws of the land or the rules of the land. So we need to know what's best and how to comply with them. But there's been a lot of chaos over DEI. But like I said, before I get into that, I got to address my t-shirts. So a lot of you are on Spotify. Our listenership is really booming on Spotify. Thank you for that. Yay. Tell your friends. But we also put this on YouTube, I guess, right, Caroline?
Yeah.
I do not know, but apparently you told my mother that we put this on YouTube because my mom is probably the one of 5 people that look at YouTube and watch this because she wants to see her little baby boy. And Brian, why are you in t-shirts? Why don't you dress for success? You used to be in the military, you used to wear uniforms, and then, Brian, you were a lawyer, you had ties and nice suits. And I was like, Mom, man, those days are past me. I do have suits. I wore a tie just last week for the first time in 7 or 8 months. But I commuted to work today on the bike. And I got to commute home today on the bike, and I'm wearing a t-shirt, Mom. So, like, it's not 1975. Let it go. We can do a great job and wear t-shirts. She's going to give me heck for this one. I can guarantee. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, I do want to get into the claim versus reality of what DEI is. And is DEI now illegal? And I want to start with the premise that is DEI illegal? And the claim is that you cannot do DEI anymore, that it's banned. But this is not the reality. That's a bit misleading. The federal law, remember at state laws, we have federal laws, right? The federal laws, no federal law has completely banned DEI in public schools. What has happened, though, is a wave of restrictions at both the federal and a lot of individual states. So I'm not going to dig into every individual state right now. If you'd like me to start to police states, let us know, send us an email, comment, or whatnot. I can dig into individual states. But know your individual states' rules and what the federal law is. But they are targeting how a school implements DEI-related programs, especially if there are federal or state funding is involved, which at almost every public school there is. Okay. So at the federal level, executive orders, I think the last one was actually back in February of 2025, and it's June right now, but courts are starting to rule on this stuff, and that's why I wanted to get into it today, which is at the federal law, executive orders have warned that funds cannot be used for divisive concepts. It's interesting. Some people would say they're inclusive concepts, and some people would say they're divisive concepts. But no matter what your opinion is they're going to start to limit the amount of funding that goes to anything DEI. And at state law, places like Florida and Texas, Oklahoma have outright banned DEI offices or any race-conscious training and even some types of support groups. So, but remember, we've got Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. That's the main law of the land when it comes to civil rights and discrimination. And that is still the law of the land. And Title VI was put out in 1964. And I think that almost every American, unless you're a crazy person, will say that is an outstanding law. The Title VI, which is the Civil Rights Act, is an outstanding law of the land since 64, still in place. We can't discriminate. We can't treat poor people, we can't discriminate against them for one of those protected reasons. Right? Race, religion, gender. And you got some other laws out there too, like Title IX, Title I, and things. But those are still the laws of the land. And an executive order cannot change those laws. An act of Congress would have to. So just because we don't have programs the federal government is going to pay to support DEI, like they're going to take that money away, doesn't mean that schools can discriminate or that anyone wants you to discriminate. So just remember, Civil Rights Act still complies, and that's the best thing. Okay, so what what can schools do and can't they do now? Right? Okay. Let me tell you what's still allowed in most states. And this is allowed in states, even Texas, Florida. So this is cool. We can still teach history, including slavery and civil rights and cultural awareness. So all that's cool. As long as, this is the key, as long as it's not labeled as political or ideological indoctrination. Now, I could barely pronounce that word. Not labeled as political or ideological indoctrination. Remember, I had a speech impediment as a child, and that was a really big word to say. We're going to split razor's edge on that one. I would say that we don't know exactly what that standard means, but teach the facts. Teach both sides of an argument. I don't know if there's really two sides to slavery. There's not two sides. It's wrong, and we should teach that. But for these other things, cultural awareness can have many facets, and you can let the kids. Don't try to push them to either the left or the right politically. And I think that's what the federal government is attempting to not do, but you get some states that maybe they're pushing to the left and right too. I don't know. But I would just, if I'm a school administrator, I'm going to encourage you to kind of focus back on the basics again until we really flesh these rules out, right? The second thing that is a lot of most states, promoting respect, inclusion, and safety for all students. Nowhere in here did the president, Congress, anybody say, hey, we want you to bully kids and we want you to attack them for being one of these protected groups or for having gender identity issues or whatever those issues are. We want to promote a safe, respectful, inclusive place that allows students to learn. Still the law of the land. The third thing, we want to ensure equal opportunity in hiring and all disciplinary practices. And that's still the Civil Rights Act, man. So none of that's changed. Now what, though, is increasingly being banned or at least restricted? And that's really, I think, where the meat comes down to this. Mandatory DEI rules, no-go. Or implicit bias training for staff. What does that mean? I don't know either. I know. I wish I could say I know, but until a court defines what mandatory DEI, you're going to have to use your best judgment. Look, I'm a lawyer by trade. I'm still stuck with all that legal knowledge, and I don't like to guess. And maybe we can dig into in other court issues what's mandatory, what was been considered not mandatory. But there's probably going to be a series of rules. I would suspect on if you do these 3 out of these 8 things, that looks like it's mandatory. Do you require people to participate? Well, you know that's mandatory. If, say, everyone has to participate in whatever this diversity, inclusion, equity project is, that feels mandatory to me. It doesn't feel voluntary anymore. But I would guess if we have a funny thing in the Army called voluntold. You voluntold, which means you didn't volunteer, but you're voluntold, which is still mandatory. So if you're requiring all of your staff and all your students to be involved in something regarding DEI that is not based on teaching of history, civil rights, it's probably looking like it's banned. So, watch yourself. Now, what also is banned or restricted? Any hiring practice or scholarship programs that use race, gender, or identity as a factor. Now, that's going to be for higher ed, mainly, except for the hiring. So in a lot of these states and most areas, you can't say, we only want to hire X percentage of this particular group. Well, back in my day, I think that was referred to as affirmative action. And then we had Civil Rights Acts. And look, this is such a dangerous, slippery slope. The diversity of our nation is our strength. I mean, there's no getting around it. And I'd love to debate somebody that thinks it's not. I'm privileged to live in Memphis, Tennessee, with all of our problems. And Memphis was the first majority-minority metro area in the United States, which means we have more African Americans than other racial groups in our metro area. And that's awesome. It's awesome because I learned so much about how other people think, react, and respond to things. And when I was in the Army, I was one of only one white officer in my brigade. in my battalion, I was the only one. And I don't know, we really didn't think about race as much as we thought about how much we didn't like the Air Force people. That's an inside Army joke. But I used to jump out of the Air Force planes, and they were always feeling like they were out to get me for some reason. But I guess, all joking aside, when you're around people with many, many different views, you're going to learn. And you're going to understand people. And you're going to learn something, and hopefully they pick up something, and then you're all better off. Our office, for instance, is vastly female. Say what you will. That's a joke too, Caroline. That's just a joke. But it's also more other races than white. I mean, it's a majority African American. Then I think the next subset is Hispanic. And then the next set is Asian, I think, and then white. And I think that's it. I think that's how our office makes up. But we are stronger for it. So we actually, in our office, hire around that. We try to make sure that we increase diversity with every hire to the extent possible. But public schools can't really do that now under this particular ban. So watch yourself. All right. Now, and don't forget, and we talked about this before, FERPA, I never say it right, but it's the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. And it restricts how schools can collect and share identifying data without parental consent. So if you're sharing data that breaks your students down into different demographic groups, be careful. Make sure your lawyers or your staff check out FERPA and make sure that it's in compliance with that. All right. I've got kind of a litany here of what schools were required to do under DEI, but I think that you probably have all had that so much. You got it. You know about it. I probably don't have to skin that, this old Southern phrase, skin that cat. Don't really skin the cat. We just got a new cat last night. My daughter's going to hear this and think I'm not literally skinning a cat. But, well, actually, you know what? I should address them quickly. And we should talk about whether or not it was mandatory or not mandatory. So let's do that. Okay. So what schools were required to do was policy and oversight. They had to hire DEI officers or teams. That's going to be a violation. That's going to breach all. If you want federal funding, you better watch that. So bye-bye DEI offices or teams. Like, you can't have that if you're not supposed to be making that mandatory. At least that's the right. It doesn't mean you can't have a hiring team that's focused on bringing the best people together. Just something to think about. Originally they were, before the bans, schools were implementing equity-centered hiring and disciplinary and access policies. Watch all that stuff. Go back there and read. Man, and this is such a pain. Schools' jobs are educate kids, but now they have to go and adjust all these policies and take all this time to adjust it based on these laws instead of just training the babies. And so we want to penalize public schools for not using our taxpayer dollars as efficiently as we would like them to in theory, but then we make all these requirements on them. It's such bunk, man. It drives me nuts. All right. Professional development. Watch that training. Watch that bias training. And like, look, if you don't know what bias training is, you better have somebody else look at it and have lots of different groups. If anyone thinks that it can be bias and you're training your staff on it, you could get a lawsuit. And one of the things that you're going to see is reverse discrimination lawsuits increase. Now, as a labor employment attorney, this was in the, 99, 2000, 2001, when I was a young man doing labor and employment law. And the biggest lawsuits that we were getting during that time period were discrimination lawsuits of men, not women, men claiming they were discriminated against based on their sex. Now think about that. The law, let's be real. The law was designed to protect women from discrimination. That's what the law was designed for. But it's got to work for everybody. But it wasn't men saying that women were discriminated against them. It was men saying that other men discriminated against them. And this was before sexual orientation was a protected class. In some states it is, right? And so it was literally, I saw this lawsuit multiple times. Gay men suing other men, gay or not, for discrimination. Interesting, right? And then some people began to see the rise of white people using Civil Rights Act to sue for discrimination. They called it reverse discrimination, but it's just discrimination. It's just discrimination is when you take a group of people, and we all group people together. We do that It's the only way to stay organized. And I can get into psychology on that one at excruciating detail. But we have to put people into buckets. Family, not family. School friends, not school. Whatever it is. It just keeps us compartmentalized. But what we don't like as a nation, and we wrote laws on this, was you cannot discriminate against people for a protected class. Like we're not going to group people based on their race and then do something to them accordingly. We're not going to take somebody based on their sex or their religion, right? So we're not going to get after people that are Christians or Muslims based on their religion. We're not going to treat them poorly just because of that protected group. Now, if it's a non-protected group, shocker, you can discriminate against people. I mean, it may not be good or maybe, but if it's not a protected group, it's not a protected group. All right. So what you're going to see is more discrimination lawsuits of people that say they are being forced with other people's values. Think being forced to call somebody by a certain pronoun, or being forced to have. You're going to see this with the Title IX issues coming up with a biological. Let me see if I can get this right. Biological man competing in women's sports, right? And so you're going to see more lawsuits, but it's going to be the women that are going to be suing. It's going to be the girls in those sports suing to keep competition fair, and we've already seen that a lot. So look, if you are focused on any protected group, you better stop it. Okay, you should stop it. Okay, but Civil Rights Act still implies protect them, make sure they're not bullied, not discriminated against, right? But you can't make people go along to get along or whatever that means. Okay. I think what you're going to say is another issue that DEI had you doing was inclusive lesson plans. Inclusive is a great word. It sounds great. It could be great. It might be not so great if implemented incorrectly. You just have to make sure that it doesn't create bias for DEI issues, right? And now look, like you could certainly, DEI did create clubs and safe spaces for students, but you can't, I watched that mandatory term. Are they mandatory? Does everyone have to agree? I don't know, but I don't know if you can, I don't think that there's a problem right now as I read it of having a nice safe space for particular people. Now, I would say this. If you have a club, you can't stop somebody from entering that club because they don't fit those parameters either. I think that could be a little dicey, a little tricky. This might be interesting to see the lawsuits and how they're going to start flushing this out. And then once again, we get into we were collecting data on discipline gaps, academic disparities. You're going to have to watch that because of the FERPA law and whether or not you can be sharing that kind of information. So just make sure your lawyers look at it. Okay. I always like to end with this. What happens if you don't comply? What's the repercussions? Right? I always think about FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act laws and sunshine laws. You might have heard them as sunshine laws, which is the government has got to be transparent. And if you file, you're supposed to get the documents. And what it really is about is, let's assume your elected city council, your school board makes a decision, but it's not in public. Like they meet separately behind closed doors in smoke-filled rooms with cigars, making the decisions. What is the issue? Well, it ain't some massive penalty if they do that. They just got to go and redo the law in most cases. So the penalty ain't worth a salt, in my opinion, if they breach FOIA and sunshine laws. Okay, so what happens if you, as a school district, say, we're going to keep doing all the DEI stuff? Well, number one, you're going to risk federal penalties. Primarily, schools using federal funds are going to be prohibited, or the funds are going to be clawed back, or you're going to be blacklisted from future grants. So you're going to lose money. Well, you got to decide if that's important enough to you to do or not do this, right? But you're going to lose money, absolutely. And then in states can do the same thing. States like Florida have already passed laws slashing tens of millions of dollars for higher ed and DEI budgets. And that's going to start to emerge in the K-12 space. So it's going to start to be pushed down. All right, so you're going to lose the money. You're going to lose the money. Okay. And there are some legal and personal risks that I think you should be aware of. The Office for Civil Rights is investigating districts accused of promoting divisive concepts or discriminatory policies. Now, typically when we hear discriminatory policies, we think of discrimination against the protected groups, but not that reverse discrimination. Right? But that reverse is going to be true too. So even if you have well-intended policies, if it creates divisiveness you're probably going to get in trouble, right? We're all one big family, United States of America, right? All right. And civil suits are going to be on the rise, so get ready for they call it reverse discrimination lawsuits. It's discrimination lawsuits that are being filed by students and staff who felt left out of race-conscious programming. Yeah, so primarily you're talking about white folks, right, that feel left out of all these programs too, and you may get an uptick of lawsuits on that. And then look, if you're a superintendent, principal, DEI staff, you stop if you keep violating these laws and these policies. You could face termination, especially in certain states that have outright banned it. In Texas, for instance, a school leader lost their job after authorizing a DEI hiring practice that the state deemed illegal. So, it's weird because I don't know that particular school leader. I don't know that particular superintendent, but often the superintendents will go to the legal counsel and be like, can we do this? And legal counsel says, sure. But it's the leader that gets penalized, and it's their responsibility. I mean, they're responsible for everything that happens. So, double check those legal opinions and make sure that you're there to do the job of teaching the kids, right? So, I think that's pretty much the what you can do, what you can't do. Now, let's talk about some judicial pushback, because it's not everything's been decided. And I think that's what's really critical right now is we're still in this kind of amorphous, cloudy world right now about what's going to happen in the future. So keep paying attention, right? So in April, multiple federal judges blocked parts of this federal ban. And the words, and I wrote it down because I wanted to get it right, so let me read it. They said that the ban was too vague and violated First Amendment rights. That means parts of these laws and these federal mandates coming down may not hold up. But right now, schools have to comply unless the court absolutely and fundamentally overturns it. So it's funny, this vagueness. If it's vague, judges don't like it. Me neither, right? And don't forget, the law of the land is still the First Amendment. You have freedom of speech. Freedom of speech. Now, if you work for the government, though, you're not free from repercussions. Okay? You can have freedom of speech in your personal life, but once you decide to work for a government entity, yeah, man, you got to kind of comply with the rules. It's called a duty of loyalty to the institution that you are now working for, right? So you could lose your job and not be able to sue because you are working for them. So First Amendment's kind of a weird thing, but right now the courts are saying, look, you got a right to stand up for what you believe and you got a right to say it. So this is all too vague. So I think we got to watch that. All right. What can you do now? I'm going to end with this. What's the call to action? Well, number one, check out your state laws. Let's don't assume that all the states are the same. Read the fine print. If anybody wants me to break down the state laws, that might be fun for me too. So I don't know. But read the fine print. And then I would encourage you to document your decisions. Keep really clear records of any DEI changes and your rationale behind it. And seriously, like this is, think about that mandatory versus not mandatory thing. Put down your rationales not to make this mandatory. I mean, those historic records are important. So document your decisions. And number 3, avoid banned language. Access, belonging, student safety, equity, or systemic bias. I don't know. This is a weird one, but in your rationale, remember, you're trying to take care of, educate the kids in the safest, most effective way possible. Make sure your rationales focus on that, all right? And then, look, 4th, consult some legal counsel. Call your local lawyer, state experts before implementing or removing any program. It is worth the extra time to make sure you're safe out there in this muddled world. I told you I had a speech impediment. All right. Thanks, guys. Hope this helps. Bye.